Hello and welcome to another episode of Essence, a podcast about story and self. Today I am joined by the marvelous Enfys J book. Thank you so much for joining us today.
I'm so happy to be here, Ben. Thank you.
Wonderful. It's wonderful. So I will introduce you to those who don't know who you are, although by now I think most people should know who you are.
I only have one book. Let's not get ahead of ourselves.
For those who don't know who Enfys is, Enfys J. Book is a non-binary bisexual clergy member within the Assembly of the Sacred Wheel and the High Priest of the Fellowship of the Ancient White Stag coven near Washington, D.C. Enfys has been studying Qabala since 2012 and teaching classes on magical practice since 2015, including presenting at the Sacred Space Conference. Their debut work, Queer Qabala, Non-Binary, Genderfluid, Omnisexual Mysticism and Magick, is currently available wherever books are sold. You can check out Enfys's work at www.majorqueerna.com, and they run the podcast called Four Quick Clue Book Talk with Enfys. I butchered that, didn't I, Enfys?
It's okay. It's 4 Quick Cues Book Talk with Enfys. Yeah, it is a bit of a tongue twister.
I will put all of those links down at the bottom, and I thoroughly expect all of my listeners, all 7 of you, to go and watch. I actually found you through that because you were originally interviewing Mara Starling last year.
Yeah, I got to interview Mara. I love her so much, and her work is so good. I absolutely loved Welsh Witchcraft, and it's been a really cool show. It started out as a live stream show I did last year, and then this year I've shifted it into a podcast format and added some different mechanics. I want to make it sillier and more like a game show, and that's kind of where I'm going with it.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful. And some of your most recent episodes you recorded while you were at Between the Worlds, was it?
Yeah, some of the episodes were recorded at Convocation, and some were recorded at Sacred Space Between the Worlds conference. So I have some video episodes that you can also get in audio format, but the bulk of them are going to be audio only.
I love it. I love it. I have been working my way through some of them. Wonderful talks, and the talks are very they're very quick. Like 8 minutes is your lowest one, and they go up to like half an hour. Right?
Yeah, I think the longest one is 30 to 35 minutes. I know there's so many pagan podcasts out there, and I love and respect the work that everyone is doing. And I was like, what can I do that's a little different? And I thought maybe something more random and short. So that's kind of where I went with it. And now we've got fun little sound effects and things like that when certain roles happen and whatnot. So it's a lot of fun. And also it's fun to surprise someone with a question like, what's your favorite ice cream flavor? In addition to like these deep, heavy spiritual topics.
Totally.
So
it's totally true. It's totally true. When I was starting to put the call out to people this year for this podcast, I kept threatening Morgan Daimler that I was going to ask them about advanced mechanical engineering. And we almost got that into the episode a few weeks ago, so almost.
Well, that can be a sequel episode then. You'll have to come back to that one.
It'll be a good thing. It'll be a good thing. So now your book, I mean, I'm not going to be asking you the same questions you probably always get asked. What made you write this book? But I am very curious. Kind of, let me just pull up my list of questions here. So many of the people I've had on the podcast so far have been part of the queer community, and I've always been very interested in kind of how they conceptualize their spirituality. And you answer that question in the very introduction of your book. You say, "Dear reader, Qabala is so very queer." Notice that I said Qabala is queer and not could be considered queer. That word choice is intentional. This book is not about arbitrarily, tenuously aligning queer concepts to Qabala as a gimmick. I'm not reinventing Qabala because it doesn't need to be reinvented. The fundamentals of what makes Qabala queer have been part of Qabala for centuries. Now, obviously, your book is about queering Qabala, or queer Qabala. Mm-hmm. What was the evolution of you coming to understand Qabala in that way? I know you say in the book that you came to Qabala in what, 2010, was it?
2012-ish, I think, was when I read Witch's Qabala by Ellen Cannon Reid. And part of what got me really into Qabala is the fact that the Wiccan tradition I'm part of, which is the Assembly of the Sacred Wheel, has a lot of ceremonial magic and Golden Dawn influences. And one of those pieces is Qabala, and specifically Hermetic Qabala that has been used kind of in an occult context for centuries. though of course it shares many things in common roots with the Judaic practice of Qabala, which is usually spelled and pronounced a little bit differently. The mystical approach is more of the like focusing on different levels of consciousness and the process of bringing something into manifestation and spiritual growth and being able to kind of map the universe onto the Tree of Life glyph. So I was interested in it because it seemed really complicated. as a former declared gifted child from my school days, I sort of relish the challenge, right? You know, something it's like, well, you say it's complicated. Let me see if I can understand it. And then when I don't understand it immediately, I get frustrated and annoyed, but which was the case with Qabala, because even just reading Ellen Kinnan Reid's book, The Witch's Qabala, it starts out with, okay, let's talk about Qabala, and then gives you these tables of correspondences right out of the gate, which is frequently how that is taught. Like, you have to know what each sphere is named, what the astrological correspondence is, the tarot correspondence. You've got to know what herbs go with it, what archangels, what choirs of angels, like all these kind of things, and usually with a pretty heavy like Christian overlay as well. So you know, despite my initial being like some parts of this I don't really groove with, I don't really like the emphasis being put on Jesus here when I came from Christianity and did not want to go back. But Qabala is a really, really good example of like magical source code. So it's a little bit like, I'm going to date myself here, back when computers ran DOS in the 80s, you know, you had to sort of bring up a program to bring up your other programs, right? And so Qabala is like that initial program that you can map all sorts of different magical systems onto. So I was intrigued because I wanted to know how magic worked. And Qabala is a fairly elegant explanation of the hows of that, and how I came at it from a queer perspective ultimately, because I was in the phase of, you know, when you start out on a magical journey and you're just like absorbing everything that you take in and not really engaging with it as much. You're like, well, these people know more than me, so clearly everything I'm reading must be true. You know, the first 5 years or so, you're just like, yes, obviously this is true. But I kind of took it as granted, like all the gender binaries and patriarchal kind of concepts that are woven within how Kabbalah is usually taught. And then one day I was reading Rachel Pollack's The Kabbalah Tree. And in the middle of that book, she has sort of this interesting aside where she says, all of the tree's names are gendered in Hebrew. And then I saw that the top two spheres, just below the first sphere of Keter, Binah and Chokmah, are both feminine names in Hebrew. And my brain blew up for just a moment, because those are often taught as like the archetypal grand phallus of the universe that create the archetypal masculine and the great archetypal feminine, but they're both feminine names and actually personified feminine characters in the Bible who are co-creators of the world with God. So I kind of sat with that and I was like, this is super interesting. And then I started to pull on the thread more and I'm like, wait a minute, I've been sort of viewing this in a very binary concept along with a lot of my magic and just sort of taking that as a given. And then I started pulling on the threads and I started digging deeper and seeing, wait a minute, there is so much to this that is just inherently queer, inclusive, and representative. Not just like, oh, you could sort of find a little space for us over here. The whole tree is queer in and of itself. And I went looking for information. Like, I'm like, surely I'm not the first to have this idea. And I'm not, you know, there have been people teaching about this, but I could find nothing online, no books, even all the books I have on it. None of them really seem to address the concept of queerness in the Tree of Life. And I was like, well, the pandemic hit and I thought, well, I'm going to do this blog post series about it because I think it's really interesting. And then one of my mentors, Ivo Dominguez Jr., was like, you could make a book out of this. And I'm like, I mean, could I really? I don't like, I'm not sure I'm ready for that. And he encouraged me. And I was like, well, there's a pandemic. My band is not performing right now. I have time. Why don't I try to write a book and see if I can make that happen? And I did. And I offered it to a couple publishers and Llewellyn said yes. And here it is now, which is awesome. But yeah, for my own spirituality, finding those inherent inclusiveness, which kind of worked in tandem with me really embracing my non-binary
I was going to
identity.
ask, right?
Yeah, like these things happen at very similar times in my life. Like
Mm,
within the same couple of years, I was like, wow, Qabala's super queer. Wow, I'm even queerer than I thought. And sort of weaving those threads together has been really a very important part of my journey.
that was my next question. I was very curious about the relationship between kind of your non-binary journey and your spiritual journey, because to be even able to conceptualize, to see, what do you, how can I ask this question? When you started to see that the top two spheres were feminine,
Mhm.
was there already an inkling inside of you that you were queerer than you were?
Oh, I'd have to look back at the actual timing of those events,
Mhm.
and I'm not sure.
Yeah.
But I think I can safely say that at that point in my life, I had a number of trans friends and still do,
Mhm.
and already had been introduced to some more like gender can be more wibbly wobbly. Like I actually took a women's studies course in the 90s back in college where we went through all the different definitions of biological sex and gender and all these ways in which those are just not very clear lines. Anywhere you try to draw a line, you are going to exclude people that should be included. So yeah, it's like I already had kind of the thought in the back of my head, but I didn't really know anyone who was non-binary. When like for most of my life, I'd say first non-binary people I met were like in my mid to late 30s. And it was kind of like when I figured out I was bisexual, it was like way later than I should have, but I'm like, I was in this place of am I a lesbian or am I straight? Am I a lesbian or am I straight? I have to pick one. I don't want to pick one. Oh, wait, there's a third option, duh. And I
Mhm.
didn't really have examples of that in my life. So so
It's
yeah,
true.
having
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, see,
Yeah.
and that's what, brief soapbox, that's what so many conservatives are afraid of right now, is that when you have examples of people, you can realize what you are, and they think we're just turning everyone trans and gay. And boy, if we had that power, I think we'd use it a lot better than we do.
I know I would. I know I definitely would. But what you're saying is absolutely true. But I mean, I think you're just a few years older than me. But I mean, even thinking 20 years ago, we didn't have even really trans characters on television that weren't being, casually murdered off screen, and then that was the whole. We didn't have
Right.
even non-binary. There was no sense of that. Even
And very
10
little
years ago,
bisexuality,
and very
even
little
like
bisexuality. Yeah.
like the only bisexual character I knew of in the 90s
Mhm.
was Ricky on My So-Called Life.
Right. Right.
And that because it was a masculine person, I didn't
Mhm.
click with
You
that
didn't
could be
connect
me.
with him. Yeah. What did you think of the Times cover when you saw the Times cover the first time? That the bisexuals have arrived. Do you feel like you had arrived?
I don't remember when that cover was. I don't think I tracked
I
that.
think it
When
was
was that cover?
I
Was
think it was
it?
like 1992 or something like that. It's
Oh, I
ridiculous.
must have totally missed it. I was in elementary school, so I probably
Fair.
was
No,
not
that's
looking at the
fair. No,
times.
that's absolutely fair. No, that's
No, but I
true.
did see recently an old cover from some music magazine circa 1982 that had David Bowie and it said the end of gender. And I was like, oh, that's so nice. I wish I'd known they ended it earlier. That would have made my life so much easier
Right.
if I'd known gender was already over in the early 80s,
You wouldn't even need to have written your book.
Right. And I was not in my adolescence when like David Bowie and Freddie Mercury were big and like kind of
Mhm.
examples of more wibbly wobbly gender and
Mhm.
sexuality in the 80s. I was oblivious to
Mhm.
all of that. And then once I was a teenager and trying to figure out, what is my identity, there really wasn't anyone I could point to that, had those qualities. I just assumed, well, I've got these two options. I don't like either of them.
Well, and you talk about that. You talk about that in the introduction to your book as well, with Kabbalah specifically. So many of the introductory texts are homophobic, transphobic, racist,
Mhm.
sexist, all of the isms, and yet they're still held up as these are the introductory texts. These are the texts.
Yeah, and I'm guilty of doing this too, where like you read a book 20 years ago and you remember loving it, so you recommend it to someone, and then they're like, well, I didn't like it, and then you go back and you read it like, oh, I don't remember any of this. Like, that stuff didn't stick out to me then, but it does now, and wow, I should stop recommending this book. And I think a lot of folks in the pagan community run into a similar issue. Like, they're just like, oh, well, I read this, seminal, I read the mystical Qabala, this is a great book, I got so much out of it. And they forget that there are diatribes about how, like, you can really only study Qabala if you are of Western descent. Like, Qabala is not appropriate for people from Asia, but like, it's the yoga of the West is how Dion Fortune describes it. And we won't get into all the reasons that's problematic. But yeah, there's a whole lot of just straight up sexism, xenophobia, racism, and just casually tossed around and used as sort of like, well, obviously this is true. And the ableism especially really gets to me in mystical Qabala. Just like, if you have any kind of disability, like, you don't get to practice spirituality. Basically, you will never be whole physically, so you can't be whole spiritually. I'm like, wow. She went there. Wow, why anyway,
it's so bizarre when we actually really look at those the characters. I won't say characters, those people from back then, because they were like characters, right? They were very countercultural in their day compared to the rest of the society that they were in. They were very countercultural, but they were still very much part of those societies back then. Yeah,
absolutely. And they were parroting what their culture, their monoculture, was saying about stuff. So it probably wasn't really controversial at the time. It should have been. But reading it now, I can see why, I got into mystical Qabala as like my third or fourth book on Qabala, I think. And I remember thinking, wow, this is really frustrating to get through, especially the introduction is the most rambly. Like, I desperately want to edit this book because it's a transcribed series of lectures. So it wanders, and there's a whole long section where basically she's like, I am but a woman, I can't really talk about this. And I was like, wow, starting your book by saying you shouldn't be writing or talking about this is a real good one. That seems cool. So yeah, I mean, those books that people read, and not everyone is assigned the same books, and some people have had the foresight to assign better books, like Christopher Penzak's Temple of High Magic, or Temple of High Witchcraft, things like that are more modern, that still have the fundamentals and yet do not have nearly the same amount of objectionable content. We'll just call it that. So part of why I wrote the book was I wanted to write the book that I wish I could have read when I started studying Qabala. And it's been fantastic to have people, like multiple people, come up to me and say, I hated Qabala. I really had no interest in it, but I read your book and now I'm interested in it. Or at least I've read your book and now I have enough of a working knowledge where I don't feel like such an idiot talking about it, but I'm probably not going to read anymore because I'm really not into Qabala. And I'm like, that's fair. If I at least give you a working grasp of it, then I've done my job.
Absolutely. Again, self-identifying here, Kabbalah has never been my thing, and I don't even know why. I don't know why I never really gravitated towards it, but it just wasn't. I didn't feel connected with it. And yet, reading your book as an example of possibility, I think was very inspiring for me. I came across your book at around the same time that I was coming out of non-binary myself. And so I was really grasping for any kind of queer spirituality content that I could. Fortunately, the majority in the past 20 years of kind of queer spirituality books in the pagan sphere have been gay men, right? Gay men or lesbians. And as I'm not a lesbian, I didn't feel connected with that. And so much of gay culture, gay male, cis male culture, I should say, is about sexuality. And at that point, it was like, okay, well, I'm starting to identify myself differently here. I'm not really sure I'm comfortable with my body. I'm on a journey here. I'm not sure I want to have like a dick always in my, sacred dick. But
sidebar. So my ex-husband worked for the Washington Blade newspaper, like 15 years ago, and I got to march in the Pride Parade with their staff, which was awesome. But the float they did that year was the globe, like a large version of the Earth. It was probably like 8 feet in diameter, with a rolled up newspaper jutting out of it at a particular angle to evoke a certain aesthetic. And I remember just being like, huh. So it's, yeah, like you say, there's so much of queer culture is dominated by the male cisgender gay culture and experience, which is very heavily ingrained with like sex and sexuality and that sort of image, which just doesn't resonate to all queer people. And
Absolutely not. No. And
they're the
there's
loudest
nothing.
voices in the room. That's all.
Well, that's the thing. They're the loudest voice in the room. They have needs, certainly.
Mm-hmm.
But what I'm noticing, at least there's a shift towards finding those liminal spaces. I know you
Mm-hmm.
spoke to Ariana Serpentine a few weeks last year,
Yes.
and
Mm-hmm.
you're a big fan of their book. I interviewed them
Oh,
a
it's so
couple of weeks
good.
ago too. Really important. But what I find interesting is, and we were talking about this before we started recording, that discussion in the community between kind of the polarity based systems and the non-binary based systems outside of the bounds of those binaries. And I'm kind of curious, what are your thoughts on the idea of binaries versus polarities? How does that come into your spiritual practice, and what do you think of it?
Well, I think like most people who are working within a Wiccan tradition in particular, or Wiccan influence sort of groups, you're taught binaries like this is masculine energy, this is feminine energy, like this is projective, this is receptive. Like we go through a lot of different binaries, and a lot of them just based on sex and sexuality in a heteronormative model. Like this whole idea that masculine energy is projective and positive, and feminine energy is receptive and negative, and basically, oh, and kind of like a assertive dominant versus submissive sort of dynamic as well.
Right.
Like feminine energy has things done to it, whereas
Mm,
masculine energy does the things. And to me, that's just like rape culture writ large. The idea that like reinforcing those norms doesn't feel good to me, especially in my magic. I don't love that idea. For some, it's also there's also kind of a squick with performing the symbolic great rite with a bladed weapon being the masculine and the cup being the feminine. It has kind of a violent connotation.
mhm,
And it was, again, it's one of those things I just took as rote. Like when I first studied, I'm like, yes,
mhm.
obviously this is how the world works. And then it was like, wait a minute. Hey, the more I thought about it. And some really great work done by Yvonne Abero, who is a non-binary pagan who has been writing about non-binariness in British traditional witchcraft for I think 15, 20 years at this point, had some fantastic words to say about like queering the great right and removing the binary piece from it. So for me, I think that I don't want to come out and say that binary polarity doesn't exist or it's not useful. I think it can be useful, especially as training wheels, rather than getting into much more complex energy, interactions. You can teach it, but I think I would just like to remove masculine and feminine labels from that binary. Like, I don't think there's any reason we have to have those specific labels on them. And I think labeling them that way is just undergirding patriarchy and rape culture. So I'm fine if you want to say there's this projective positive energy and there's this receptive negative energy. Cool. Teach it as you like. My experience with energies is like the further I get in my studies, the less useful I find that combination of energies to be. I look at things like the pentacle. I mean, we've got 5 different elemental interactions happening there. The
Absolutely.
tree of life itself, you've got 22 paths connecting. There's nothing really binary about it. And yeah, I just feel like there's so much more to energy interaction that some people start learning that and they kind of get stuck like that's the only way to work with
Mhm.
energy is insert tab A to slot B and boom, you get magic. I think there's just more to it than that. And the deeper I get in my studies, the less useful I find that binary viewpoint.
That makes sense. That makes sense. And that leads into my next question for you, actually. I'm always very curious with writers how their own personal practice is affected. As you
Mm.
were writing your book, what were some of the things that changed and shifted for you? What were because I'm assuming it was a growth process for you writing this book as well, based on some of the things you said. What was that like
Yes.
for you? What was that process like?
It's kind of hard to tease apart. I was writing the book during the initial year of the pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
And my personal journey was definitely impacted by that alone. Like even setting all the gender sexuality stuff aside, I think every author working in that context has been affected and grown in some way, or been affected or traumatized, and all of those different things. Yeah, like we've undergone a global trauma. None of us have really reconciled that yet. We're just sort of, that's a different soapbox. But I think for me, there's this concept I've heard, the COVID cocoon. It's what someone calls it. A lot of people, when suddenly they're not out performing their gender, their sexuality themselves with a social group, spent time figuring out, who actually am I? And as a result, a lot of people came out as trans and non-binary during the pandemic. Self-included. Like I think I'd been using the non-binary label for a while, but I didn't actually take the steps to embrace that and a new name and pronouns that felt good until like I'd been 9 months in the pandemic. So there's that sort of, those pieces together, I think really helped me better embrace who I am. Like both the isolation from social stuff and slightly, losing my mind over over a vast global trauma, but also taking that time to look at myself a little differently and think, who am I? And is the person I've been behaving as still me? Does it still serve? Is it who I want to be? And I found that, there's some things yes, some things no. And I think my own growth benefited quite a bit from that situation.
Not true that.
So yeah, there's a lot of different intertwinings there. There's also one of the things I meant to say earlier, within my tradition, we have it's a mystery tradition. We have initiations, right? So for my second degree initiation, it's meant to be an upbuilding. So your first degree is a simulated death and rebirth experience that's customized for the person undergoing it. The second degree is kind of like building you up a bit more. And then the third degree is another death and rebirth experience. So like bringing you down, rebuilding you again. So that second degree happened for me, I think it was 2019, right before the pandemic. And that is an experience where you do perform the symbolic great rite in the ritual. You take the blade and you insert it in the chalice, with the idea being you are uniting the dynamic parts within yourself to become stronger. And I'm not going to say that ritual made me non-binary, but I will say that a lot of my acceptance and understanding of myself as a non-binary person followed that ritual. So that it's certainly not the expected outcome. I think I'm probably the only person who has really experienced that among all the many people who've had a second degree initiation in my tradition, but it certainly got me thinking along those lines. And like, does the concept of masculine or feminine even make sense to me anymore? And yeah, I'm still noodling that one, to be honest. I like to think of my gender on more of a Z axis rather than on this continuum of masculine to feminine. I'm like, I'm up in this totally different area here. Gender's exhausting and I just want to be a cloud. That's where I'm at.
Absolutely. I love what you said about that moment. It didn't make you non-binary, but it clicked, something unlocked, it sounds like.
Yeah, there's definitely a shift within, and a positive one.
Absolutely. What I find interesting, though, you said before, you wrote the book that you wish you had 10 years ago or 12 years ago. How much of this book would be different now if you hadn't gone through that secondary initiation, do you think?
I don't think the book would exist, honestly. Okay. I think it was foundational enough to my understanding of myself and shifting in my understanding of Qabala, because my second degree work was very Qabala focused. It was developing rituals about each of the Sephiroth in the Tree of Life for my coven to guide them through sort of walking up the Tree of Life experience in preparation for, we do a big ritual in my tradition every few years called Climbing the Tree, where people go individually through 10 separate stations and have like a mini ritual at each sphere. And it's incredible. If you ever get a chance to do it, highly recommend it. So I did this whole thing teaching them, and that's what got me so excited to deepen my work with the Tree of Life. And there were a lot of Qabala elements in my second degree ritual as well that I really resonated with. So it was really, really cool. And I think had it not been for that second degree, I probably would not have written this book.
It's incredible, isn't it? How even just a singular moment experience can shift so much, right? Yeah,
Absolutely.
absolutely. So, I mean, the way you're talking about Kabbalah, I can relate in many different ways through my own spiritualities. What do you hope that people are getting out of your book? What do you hope that people are like, ignoring all the reviews, because we know what they say, right? At least I hope you're not looking at the reviews, but
I generally don't, unless someone sends it to me like, here's a really nice review, then I'll read it. But yeah, I try to stay away from Goodreads because that way lies despair. And side note to anyone, if you have enjoyed any book, please do leave positive reviews on Amazon or Goodreads, because they really, really help boost the algorithm. And you don't have to say a lot. You can just say, I liked it, and leave it at that. And it's wonderful. That is the best gift you can give to your author friends. But that said, I remind me the question again. I'm sorry, I got on a tangent.
A little plug to an insistence of a good review. I think that's good.
Yes. I'm wondering, it was what people got out of the book.
Yes. Yeah. What do you hope people are getting out of your book?
Well, I've been really pleased when people told me, like, I really not a big Qabala fan, but this helped me at least, approach it from a different perspective. I also really appreciate when people say that this, as a queer person, I found something I can relate to, where maybe you were kind of struggling to find where you fit into your spirituality, because a lot of our longstanding pagan traditions arose during the age of Pisces, when, boy, do we love us some binaries. And the people who started those traditions are getting older and maybe are not as connected with the current queer movement. So I hope people can come away from the book finding something that they can use authentically as a queer person. I also really hope Qabala practitioners and teachers who've been studying it for a while can expand their understanding of the Tree of Life and have new ways to make it more relatable for people they're teaching to, and maybe step back from the whole, maybe I don't need to put binaries all over this thing. Maybe that's not the best way to teach it.
Absolutely. An invitation to explore something different outside of that. Absolutely.
Exactly.
Yeah, absolutely. So now, kind of the last question before we wrap up for the evening. I know it's been out for a year, about a year, 18 months?
About a year, yep. It came out last June of 22.
Absolutely. And you started working on it 2 years before that-ish?
Yeah, I started working on it in February or March of 2020.
Oh. Okay, so, well, I say I love it because it's very similar to my own experience. I started writing mine around that time too, so it's been a very quick few years.
It has.
So what are you working on next? You've got this baby out there already. What's next for you?
I have a few things in the hopper. I contributed to the 2024 Sabbats Annual that's coming out from Llewellyn, I think this summer. I contributed a sort of a think piece plus a ritual for Yule in that. I've also am working on a contribution for the 2025 Sabbats Annual that will be about Ostara, and I'm really looking forward to writing that probably in the next month. But I also was the secondary author on one of the books in the Witches' Sun Sign series that is just starting to come out, where Ivo Dominguez Jr. was the primary author on these 12 books, and then each had a secondary author who was part of that sign, or who has that sun sign, and several contributors who are other pagans who have that same sun sign, with offering recipes, small rituals, things like that. They are gorgeously designed books. They are meant to be very giftable. They're made to be very readable. So Ivo wrote all the, pardon me, all the crunchy astrology bits. And then the second authors add more like our lived experience as that sign. I had the burden of being the second author on one that is Ivo's sun sign. We are both Sagittarians. No pressure.
No pressure at all. Yeah.
So, but it was it's written in a very conversational style. For those second authors are like, this is my experience and my recommendations for how you can harness the power of your sun sign to be a better witch, to be a better person. So that was a ton of fun to write and an interesting stretch for me, because I've been like increasing my astrology know-how, but it's not like my first love. So it was an interesting challenge and also really enjoyable to write. So that's coming out. The Sagittarius Witch is coming out, I believe, April of 2024. The first books in the series, which starts with the Aries Witch, comes out, I think, in just a couple of weeks as we're recording this. I believe in June. Yep, June of 23, that should be out. And they're releasing 3 of them a quarter for the next year. So if you are, especially if you are a solitary practitioner, I think they will be exceptionally useful. But really, for anyone in your life who maybe would like to have such a personalized gift of, you know, you're a witch of this sign, here you go. I think it's going to be really great. I'm super excited about it. And then I'm also working on a book of queer rites of passage for Llewellyn that I believe will be coming out mid-2025. So a bit of a wait on that one. I'm still writing it. But I'm super excited because something I'm very passionate about is the concept of rites of passage, and how many have been kind of either don't exist or been stolen from us as queer people. We don't have the same path as our heteronormative straight friends.
Absolutely.
And also just being able to look at, like, sidebar on that, actually. So I read this article in college. We were learning about, it's going to be kind of dark, but we were learning about female genital mutilation in certain cultures. And one of the things that the anthropologist writing about this said is, you can't just take the practice away. You need to replace it with something that is like ear piercing or something.
Something meaningful.
Because the rite of passage of that can be very important. So, and that got me thinking about, like, you know, what are our rites of passage into adulthood in current Western culture? And, you know, like, there are little ones here and there, but they're not always really commemorated or celebrated. Like, coming into your own and deciding on a new name and embracing that for yourself. There's no playbook for how to do that. Like, do you throw a party? What do you do?
Yeah.
Like, I want, so to me, it's very important that we reclaim those. And also with the understanding that during the pandemic, a lot of people didn't even get like their usual graduation experience or prom, or like all of those things that we see as key moments in adolescence were just straight up taken away because the world got too dangerous. And I know there are people out there hurting because of that and feeling that lack, you know, feeling that sort of unfulfillment or that need to commemorate something. So that's another reason I wanted to approach this book, is because there are so many opportunities to commemorate rites of passage in our lives. And I think if we do that more, it makes us healthier, happier people.
Absolutely. When you were saying before we started recording that you were working on this book, I was so excited because so much of my own work with the queer community is around identity, and rites of passage is such a visceral part of that. But for so many people in the queer community, we're having to make rites of passage through things like, I know among my trans friends, going in top surgery is a huge part of that rite of passage.
Starting hormone therapy, you know,
right,
like.
exactly. And I mean, I think, again, that idea of moving into different phases, because the queer experience, at least for people our age, we didn't get to have a normal like life experience when we were younger. I think a lot of people hit adulthood when we're hitting the 30s. We didn't have that teenagehood. The 20s is teenagehood for us. So
Right.
I'm
Well,
really...
and there's this stereotype as well, that particularly trans people who come out in adulthood, like 30s or later, basically have their second adolescence and kind of going through not only the hormone changes that are similar to puberty, but also kind of like exploring more the sexuality and like relationships to people. And they kind of go through similar milestones, but much later in life. So like, what does that look like? How do you do that? You know, how do you commemorate those milestones?
Absolutely. I'm really excited. I'm going to have you back just to talk about it before it comes out, because I'm really excited by that. I talk about that sort of stuff in my own ancestral work, and my own book coming out in September has components of that, but it's such a general audience. I'm really speaking to many different groups, and I know Ariana Serpentine spoke about that in their book. But again, it's such a general audience, right? So Passage was just a small piece of it. So really looking forward to that. That's so exciting. You'll have to keep us updated on kind of on that progress.
Yeah, I'm super excited about it. And I do want to note that like there have been queer rites of passage rituals included in larger books. There just isn't a whole book of them. So I definitely want to give some love to Ariana Serpentine had some of that in the Sacred Gender, that I just love her book so much. And Misha Magdalen's Outside the Charmed Circle had some absolutely fantastic stuff in it. And Cassandra Snow's Queering Your Craft, like all of those books have great rituals that can be used. I just found myself wanting more of them, more to reach a larger audience. So I'm really excited about it.
Absolutely. That is one of the we were talking about meaning making before, and making meaningful rites of passage. And somebody can give you an idea, and it might have some semblance of something you might connect with, or it might be completely irrelevant to you. So to have as many examples, like a cookbook, really, to have as many examples as you can, I think that would be really helpful, just to jog people, to be the potential for that second initiation, like you were saying before. Absolutely. That's so
and yeah, one of the things that I'm trying to do with it, and this could completely change by the time the book comes out. So, but I'm trying to make them a little bit plug and play. Like, here are different options of what you can use for like deities. Here are some different symbols that you could use, but use whatever works for you. Like, this should be personal to you. So here are some suggestions to get you started, but by all means, change it, write your own version, throw it out and do something completely different. It's whatever works for you that's important.
I think sometimes people just need to have that invitation. People just need to have that, that example thrown out there. And even if they don't connect with that example, like you say, plug and play to shift things around to make it meaningful. Yeah.
Exactly.
Oh, that's wonderful. Well, I'm excited about that and all of your other work too. I've been seeing the front covers floating about Facebook for the series that Ivo has put together. It's such visual, beautiful book covers. I can't it's going to be
the interior design is gorgeous too. I've seen like a proof of Aries Witch and was like, this is so pretty. I love this so much. So yeah, I can't wait for these to be on shelves.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful. Well, I know I said it at the beginning of the podcast, but remind us, how can people get a hold of you if they need to look at your stuff?
I am found on majorarqueerna.com, which is majorarqueerna.com. I have a blog there, and also you will find my podcast, 4 Quick Cues Book Talk with Enfys, is now on all major podcasting platforms, and also on my website and YouTube as well. So those are the main places you can find me. I do have a Facebook page, and for now I have a Twitter account that I'm not using very much and may stop using altogether. So we'll see how things go with Twitter. But yeah, I am definitely reachable through my blog if people are interested in more of the stuff I've written, and if they want to connect, there's a contact form.
Wonderful. And again, I'll put all those links down at the bottom, and do check out and give Enfys a like on their pages. And thank you so much for coming on the show today, Enfys.
This is delightful, Ben. I really look forward to reading your book when that comes out, because it sounds like that's going to be really helpful for my research with the rites of passage, but also because it's such an important topic that I think hasn't had enough of a queer approach previously. So I'm very excited to see what you come up with, and look forward to chatting with you on 4 Quick Cues when it gets close to coming out as well.
Yes, absolutely. I look forward to joining you on there. Absolutely. Again, thank you so much. And for those of you who are watching, join us next week, where I have Moss Maffey joining from Wales, my beautiful homeland. Moss is going to join us. It'll be pre-recorded, just like today. And if you have any questions for Moss, please do send them into my Facebook page. And otherwise, have a great evening. Have a good one, folks. See you later.